So welcome our panel. We're excited.
My name is Frances Etherington, and I live in Douglas County. And I'm going to start off this panel by sharing with you some personal experiences of what it's like to live amongst industrial timber forest land. This here is a picture of my home west of Roseburg, and it's surrounded by industrial forest land. And Oregon has a unique history that mixes up rural families and industrial landowners, and I want to briefly go over this history with you so you understand why we live right next to this industrial forest land. When Oregon became a state in 1859, the federal government tried to encourage white settlement through various land grant schemes like the Homestead Act and the railroad land grants. However, much of that land did not get into the hands of settlers because of these massive land fraud deals that happened at the turn of the century. So instead, much of this land that was slated to go to settlers was instead homesteaded by the timber industry, which is why we have a huge amount of every other section in Oregon owned by the timber industry. And this has proven a problem, especially in Douglas County where I live, because of course now timber industry owns most of the private land, and nestled in between the huge tracts of industrial land are little rural resident families like mine. And this is the reason why the counties are so strapped for money. Douglas County is broke in part because the large timber companies pay far less property taxes and harvest taxes than smaller private landowners. So there's virtually very little property tax money going into the counties, which is one of the reasons why in Douglas County all our libraries are now closed. We have no public libraries anymore. So this is my home in Western Oregon. When I first drove up the driveway and saw it in 1975, I looked at this and I said, wow, look at those cliffs. They're never going to get us from behind. Little did I know that that's exactly where they will get us. These are the Callahan Cliffs. It's a sandstone formation that rises 800 feet above us. And most of the trees you see there are owned by Roseburg Forest Products, to within just feet of the house up there. And on the right side is Seneca land, and on the left and up at the ridgetop is Weyerhaeuser. So this is a picture of Roseburg Forest Products spraying fertilizer to within a few feet of our house in 2005. They didn't give us notice that they were going to do this, so you can imagine my surprise one morning when I was walking to the chicken coop in my bathrobe, and this helicopter comes zooming on down virtually right in front of me and hovers right there. So close, I could see the people inside talking to each other. And I'm just standing there appalled in my bathrobe. They later explained that they were pinpointing our property boundary. But at the time, of course, I didn't know what they were doing there. And I just stared at this invader, and then I kind of came to my senses, and I raised my hand and gave them my finger. And they immediately flew away after I did that. I said, that's the answer, right? But then they started spraying unknown substance all around our house. They used our house, right above our house, they would turn around and go back. So that was one of our first experiences with this aerial spray. So then in 2010, Seneca, who is more on our right side of that cliffs you saw, they clear-cut their property, and it categorized our property, and so we could see them logging this part of it that was so steep that the loggers had to use ropes here in order, coming down ropes with chainsaws to cut the trees down right there. This is the full extent of that clear cut there. Now 5 months after they clear cut this, we received a letter from Seneca about their upcoming herbicide spraying. And the letter said, I'm just going to quote, "Greetings from your neighbor, Seneca Jones Timber Company. We are a locally owned, managed timber company, and as such, we earnestly desire to maintain good communications and rapport with our neighbors. The purpose of this letter is to notify you that Seneca plans to aerial apply herbicides to our tree farm, which is near your property. All pesticide application work is performed by licensed applicators and under the close supervision of professional foresters who have many years of training and experience in herbicide application. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has registered and approved each chemical we use to assure the safety of our workers and our neighbors as well as the forest environment. Unquote. So this is a letter they sent out to adjoining landowners who are about ready to get doused. So we called them up and we said that we wanted to be notified of the exact date they were going to apply the herbicides, and they don't have to tell us. But in Seneca's case, they usually do. If you ask them, they will tell you. And one morning at 5 a.m., we got the phone call that they were going to spray, and so we jumped in our car and drove up to where there was a good viewpoint where we could film it in a safe distance away. So this is some of what we saw right here. You know, people often ask, and it addressed this in the movie a bit, why are they spraying? I mean, do you see anything there? What are they spraying for? Well, the reason they are spraying is so they can kill every living thing in their clear cut except for what is going to make them money. And it is all about money. The spraying continued for about 3 years, sometimes twice a year. And I posted this picture here on Google Earth and said something about Seneca spraying and the chemicals they were using. And Seneca contacted me and they asked me to take it down off of Google Earth. Why? Were they embarrassed of this picture? I'm not sure. But I just ignored their request. So, this is Valerie's house. You can see the spray helicopter up there. And Valerie lived the closest to the herbicide spraying. Her garden water and her household drinking water came from a spring that was just a few yards away from the Seneca border. And about 1.5 years after the spraying started, after about 3 spray cycles, Valerie was diagnosed with an aggressive type of breast cancer. So she was dead within 1 year of that diagnosis. Now, of course, we cannot claim that the spraying caused this because, as they mentioned in the movie, there are very few studies that look at this kind of link. There are no studies that really look at this kind of link adequately. So when Seneca says to us, you know, they've approved it, the US EPA has approved it, doesn't mean that they've studied it all. So, a few years later, in 2016, Seneca sent one of their friendly letters to a friend who lives near Days Creek, that's east of Canyonville. And so they told her that they would be spraying in their clear cut, which was immediately adjacent to where she lived. She lived very close to her boundary with Seneca. So I decided to try and film that operation because I knew I could sit on the edge of some BLM land and I would be a mile away, a safe distance away, and I could still get a good view over some clear cuts, older clear cuts. So here is my view. And this is their unit right here that they're going to spray. This was the older clear cut. This is where Nancy lives right here, and there's another residence right here. So here's where they service the helicopters, which I didn't know. I mean, when I first set myself there, I parked way off on the side of a logging road, thinking that they were going to service the helicopters over here somewhere. So I was really surprised, you know. I had to sleep there the night before because they start spraying really early, and I woke up in the morning with these huge monster trucks trying to squeeze by my car on that little logging road because they were the trucks that service the helicopter with herbicides and gasoline and such, right there. So since they saw my car there, Seneca suspected whose car that might be. Maybe it was the same person who filmed them on Florida Valley a few years ago and posted their picture on Google Earth. So I saw 2 Seneca trucks leave here, and 20 minutes later I saw them go up into the unit, and they parked a car by Nancy's place and by our neighbor's place so no one could go out while they were spraying. And here's a picture of them spraying right next to Nancy's house. There's Nancy's house. Here's the helicopter. There's the guy protecting Nancy from accidentally driving away. Nancy went out and talked to him, and the Seneca asked him, he says, "Is that Frances Etherington parked up there?" He knew my name. "And is she taking pictures?" So meanwhile, I was taking pictures. And later on, Seneca contacted me, and they threatened that if I posted any of these pictures and said anything negative about them on the internet, that they would never give Nancy notice again. Nancy wouldn't be able to prepare because they aren't required to give people notice. That's one of the big problems in our laws. They aren't required to give specific notice, only a notice from within a year of when they're going to spray. So they said if you post any of these pictures and say anything bad about us, we'll never give Nancy notice again of when we're going to spray, which means Nancy couldn't prepare. She couldn't, close her windows, bring her dog inside, and maybe most importantly, she couldn't go get her horse out of the pasture and bring the horse into the barn. Because while Seneca is legally required to stay 60 feet away from Nancy's house, they could literally, legally spray to within 1 inch of her horse. So I took a few of my pictures and I posted them in a separate account and sent the link to Seneca, and I said, "Well, is this negative? Can I post these on the internet?" And they emailed me back and they said, "Well, no, those aren't negative. As a matter of fact, those are really good pictures for you being so far away." They kind of complimented me on the pictures, and they said, "No, it's not negative." So I took all the pictures and I put them on my Flickr album, and they're there, available for anyone to download and use. But just don't give me credit. That's fine. So the following year, they did give Nancy notice that they were going to spray. Here they are spraying the following year. There's where Nancy lives, right there. Now, they're going to spray again later this month, and they have notified Nancy of when they're going to do it. And they are, and they're willing to give her the exact date, even though that's not required by law. Some companies are willing to do that, but only if you don't say anything negative about them on the internet. By the way, that's the web address of the pictures. Anybody wants any of these pictures? There's about 100 of them there. So just another really quick story. In 1997, during a big rainstorm, a landslide rolled out of a 10-year-old clear cut above Hubbard Creek, just 6 miles north of where I live, 6 miles due north. This landslide killed 4 people when it rolled over their house. The children were nimble enough to be able to run away in their bare feet, but all the adults got rolled over by the landslide and died. So, Oregon Department of Forestry added a rule to the Oregon Forest Practices Act. It's the last rule. Well, it's not really, but so they added a rule that said if clear cutting on high landslide hazard location, it's called HLHL, it's well defined, high hazard landslide location, and there is a house below where people could be killed by a landslide, the loggers have to leave 50% of the trees on the unstable slopes above. So we get a call from Oregon Department of Forestry just a couple months ago, and they said that Seneca wants to log next to where I showed you all the first spray pictures. They're going to log next to it in the headwaters of Dicer Creek, the beloved creek that flows through our property that we love so much. And so it's a high landslide hazard location, and of course it's that HLHL, they pretty much know it's going to be a big landslide, right? And so Oregon Department of Forestry asked to come out and measure our house to see if it qualified for this new safety regulation. So they came out and they measured that our house was 28 feet above the creek. And they said, congratulations, you're out of the danger zone. 20 feet, and the loggers would have to leave 50% of the trees up there. But we were at 28 feet, so they didn't have to leave anything. So we're looking forward to another big clear cut, years of aerial spraying, and maybe 10 years down the road, a big landslide ruining our creek, but hopefully not killing us if we stay in our house. So this is just a little taste of what life of rural families is like in Oregon, living among the industrial forest lands there.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Ann Kneeland, and I'm here with, excuse me, Community Rights Lane County. I think many of you know, but Community Rights Lane County is a local educational nonprofit that is seeking to advance the community rights movement, that seeks to legalize the people's right to pass laws to protect our health, safety, and welfare, and to do that in a way that strengthens those laws above the corporate rights that currently authorize the extensive corporate harms that we see here and all across the country in various forms like fracking, corporate water withdrawals, mining, and all kinds of things. So I've come to talk to you a little bit about that work, and because it's a little bit more of a historical context that gives rise to the work that we're doing and understanding the need for us to recognize our right of local community self-government, I'm going to start this talk in a slightly different way. And that is to read to you Article 1 and Section 1 from the Oregon Constitution. And it goes like this. Article 1, Section 1, natural rights inherent in people. We declare that all men, when they form a social compact, are equal in right, that all power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their peace, safety, and happiness. And they have at all times a right to alter, reform, or abolish the government in such manner as they may see proper. You know, I think when we hear these words today, it seems rather radical, and yet this is a section that is the first section of our Constitution, and I think I'm correct when I say there's a similar section in every state constitution. And so it was the spirit of that time in the states across the United States to understand that the people had an inherent and inalienable right to self-govern. And that this was a right that allowed people to write and pass laws that were protective of the health, safety, and welfare, and to do that in a way that assured them the right of the pursuit of happiness and what all had been spelled out really in the Declaration of Independence before the federal Constitution kind of came along and put things in a slightly different frame. But at this time, the notions of our system were really based on a sort of a pyramid where the people, because they are the sovereign authority as is spelled out, were at the top of the pyramid, and government was below people in terms of the authority and operated to serve people. Below them still were corporations. Corporations were chartered by the government to do functions within our communities, to build things, but to do that in aid of government in serving the people. And there were significant limitations at that time, such as, you know, corporations were restricted from giving political contributions. There was liability for corporations conducting activities in the communities in which they operated. There was a limited duration in which they could operate. They, once their function was finished, they dissolved. They could not merge with one another. So there were significant limitations that kept corporations in a specific role. But it didn't stay like that for long. I think you probably can figure out, things changed dramatically. The federal Constitution, in stark contrast to what was the will of the states when they put forward the Articles of Confederation, and then subsequently was followed by this kind of band of James Madisonites who decided to write a federal constitution pretty much codifying the English monarchy in American terms that really recognized rights around commerce and property, and really did very little at that time when it was drafted to recognize rights for people. And it was really the states who pushed to have the Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution. And that's what we often, I think chiefly about the Bill of Rights when we think about our Constitution, and really that was almost an afterthought to the drafters, and they had opposed it some of them had opposed it in its incorporation. And so what happened was that the shift began to happen, and in the early 1800s, the first court recognized that corporations and government were in fact equal as partners in a contract, so they had equal bargaining power. And so it was kind of the first erosion of this pyramid, which had the people at that time on top, where government and corporations became essentially equal. It was later in the late 1800s that the court then found that they recognized corporations as legal persons. And well, it was pretty much downhill from there. So through the 1900s, corporations were fairly methodical and strategic about expanding their rights, not only the commerce and property rights that were recognized by the federal Constitution, but also expanding their rights under the Bill of Rights. And so they've come to have free speech rights, rights for just compensation, rights for lost profits, 14th Amendment's rights to equal protection. And so, when you think about the Bill of Rights, we think of it as a tremendous protection for we the people. We have this nice protective document that tells us that stands for the rights that we cannot be our government cannot overreach into our rights. Well, you extend those rights to corporations, and now corporations have the power to limit and control and contain what the government can do. So now you have a situation in terms of right to just compensation, where we understand it in the context, well, your government can't come seize your house to build a road without giving you just compensation. Well, in the context of corporate rights, when they exercise that power, they say, no, government, you can't stop us from doing X, Y, and Z activity because you've encroached on our rights to just compensation. So if you're going to do that, you'll need to pay us. And it's not $200,000 for the little house you live in, it's millions. And so this pretty much paralyzes government in terms of what they can consider enacting by way of limitations on corporate activities. And so it goes on like that. And so as the 20th century advanced, you really have this inversion of the pyramid where corporations have landed on top. Now they have recognized rights of legal personhood, commercial and property rights, and now government is hamstrung in compliance with those rights. And of course, the people have dwindled down to the bottom. And so it's under this system that we have things like fracking, oil and gas pipelines, corporate water withdrawals, mining, factory farms, and all kinds of massive industrial activities that extract, pollute, and poison our environment and our communities that we really have no power to stop. And when the corporations sit on top of the pyramid, they work hard to maximize profit, exercise their interest, use lots of money to influence the legislature, get favorable rulings in the courts, and control our regulatory agencies. I think one of their greatest tools is the regulatory agencies who have essentially legalized all of the harms that they engage in as a sort of a trade-off for being able to regulate them. And I think that's what gives Terry Witt the platform to say, oh, it's legal, we're doing everything legal. And so it's like, yeah, it's legal, but not because it's been tested, not because it's protective of anybody. And really what we know now is that most of the regulations are written by corporate lobbyists. And that is at the state level, at the federal level. They have created a system in which corporations can be minimally regulated. It's the regulations that they can stomach that still preserve their profits and allow the government to say what they said to Francis. Oh, the EPA has said it's okay. They know nothing about what it's really doing. They haven't studied it, and they don't study it, and they don't have the funding to study it, and yet this is what they stand on. Oh, don't worry, we wouldn't let you do it if it wasn't safe. Oh, we're the EPA. And along with the sort of the corporations owning the regulatory agencies, they operate very much the same way in our legislature. So this is how we end up with laws that preempt local communities from doing things. So this is exactly what we faced with the aerial spraying here and have faced elsewhere in terms of trying to stop other corporate harms across the country, is that the legislators have been paid money to their campaigns. They pass legislation that says to local communities, you are prohibited from passing any law pertaining to the corporate topic of the day. So we end up with the extensive legislation in Oregon that bans local communities from addressing herbicides or pesticides. Just in 2013, we saw this in action when the community rights group FIRST was moving an initiative to ban GMO agriculture. Our Democratic legislature, led by Val Hoyle, took a flurry of campaign contributions along with other legislators and passed a preemptive law banning local communities from regulating GMO agriculture. So you can watch it in motion. You know, a community steps up to do something, takes action, takes on industry, and our very own legislature very quickly, within months, took action to adopt a law essentially written by Oregonians for Food and Shelter, which was that wholesome organization that spoke on behalf of how safe it is to aerial spray our forests. So I think it's pretty clear that under a system like this, we, the people, have relatively little power to do what needs to be done. And that's why, although I have a grim perspective on things, I will say that Community Rights Lane County and FAHA, the Freedom from Aerial Herbicide Alliance, and our community, our rights, that's moving forward the right of local self-government petition, are squarely strong advocates of banning the aerial spray of herbicides. And really, probably the use of all herbicides and pesticides is what's really best for our environment. But we understand that that work must be done in a framework in which we understand the larger system in which we are working. That we are playing essentially a rigged game when we beg our regulatory agencies, when we file lawsuits under what we tout as very progressive environmental laws, and when we beg and plead with our legislators to do the right thing by us. Those are not the successful outlets for us in terms of asking them to serve us. And I think we've watched that here in Lane County pretty explicitly about how the Lane County Board of Commissioners has worked very hard to dodge any notion that they have any responsibility to stand up for our community to protect us from the aerial spray of herbicides, which I'll say is everyone's problem. It's not just a rural people's problem. I think certainly Francis has suffered from it more, but we all live downstream, and it's coming through our waterways, it's coming to our drinking water sources, and it's coming to all of us. And so we really, I think, need to, and it's the work of Community Rights Lane County, is to band together as a community and as electorate that understands the harms that we're seeking to stop and understands the context of the system in which we're seeking to stop them, and to recognize that the only way that we can meaningfully do that is by recognizing our right of local community self-government. And that is a right for us to write and pass laws under a legal authority that allows us to recognize rights greater than the right of corporations to harm us. And that is not that does not exist under our legal system. But based on what I read to you and a whole lot of other historical factoids that you could read if you'd like, we have some materials, but is to recognize that that is an inherent and inalienable right of the people. And it's only because the system of government and system of corporations have worked so hard to extinguish that from our historic memory and certainly from our laws. And so we continue to work tirelessly to recognize our right of local self-government. I think many people are aware of the struggles that we have faced with trying to move charter amendments, both to recognize our right of local self-government and also to ban the aerial spray. And it's discouraging, but it's certainly not unexpected. We are working within a system that is rigged, and we have to work to find a way out of it. As long as we play on their turf, we will lose. And we have some tools that give us marginal gains here and there, but it's our contention that we cannot make sufficient gains at this pace to save us for what is the looming kind of sixth mass extinction and climate change. So we need to find a way to empower us in a way that is inherent and inalienable to us, and that is to give us the right to pass and write the laws that truly protect us, and not to leave us begging unsympathetic lawmakers and lobbyists for a bone or scrap from the table. So keep watching the work. We are not giving up. We are still at it. Just, I guess, to whet your appetite, if you're interested in joining the work, certainly please visit us online at communityrightslanecounty.org. We also have some events, 2 events I'll tell you coming up in the fall. One, I think it's October 3rd. Chris Hedges is coming to kind of, I think, put the spotlight and amp up some of the message around the monster of corporate power that we need to frontally challenge. And later in October, I believe over the weekend of October 20th and 21st, we'll be hosting a democracy school. Some speakers from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund will be coming down to convene. We usually get about 25 or 30 people together to do a real in-depth investigation and understanding of the system that we're struggling against. And I think until we all begin to really dig in and understand what that system is, we are playing on a playing field that is not ours. So. Thank you. 3rd of October for Chris Hedges. So keep your. I think Democracy School is 19th to the 21st. So look for those, and please join us at both events if you can. Thanks very much for your attention.
My name is Jason Gonzalez. I'm the Forest and Watershed Campaign Organizer. As Pat mentioned, I work for Oregon Wild. I put up here a nice little Oregon Wild slide. This is what we start off most of our slideshows with. Been using this kind of imagery and talking point for years because what Oregon Wild has been doing for the last 45 years has been really focused on working to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for all Oregonians. But for the last several decades, the way Oregonians have come to know Oregon Wild is largely through our work to protect wilderness areas. At the heart of the organization is a citizen advocacy group for wilderness. It's what it started as, and it's really what it focused on for years. Going into the timber wars of the 90s and a lot of the last 20 years, Oregon Wild mostly was working on public lands issues like the Northwest Forest Plan, defending old growth on Forest Service lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, taking on and making issue of the now famous O&C lands and other issues. Also working on wolves, spotted owls, salmon, and other endangered species. But just a few years ago, about 2.5 years ago at this point, Oregon Wild decided to start the Forest and Watershed Campaign. The Forest and Watershed Campaign was a real breakaway from what we'd been doing in the past, and it was started specifically to work on state forest policy. And the reason that we were finally able to start such a campaign was because of the work of rural Oregonians on this issue that had created so much demand for change on this. For decades, like we've talked about a little bit today, for decades Oregonians have been resisting issues around aerial spray. And there's been some successes on specific chemicals being used, with dioxins being really made a big issue of in the past, and then a huge victory of stopping aerial spray on federal lands decades ago. But rural Oregonians that live amongst the industrial forest lands that have been complaining about this for years got really used to hearing just about everywhere they turned for help, is what I've been told, is they heard there's not much that we can do when it comes to state and private lands. Oregon's Forest Practices Act, our state logging laws, which were written in 1972 when we still painted houses with lead, were really well defended by other existing laws that support it, and were really hard to take on. So a lot of the work had been focused on public lands and endangered species issues. There was good reason for that. Did a lot of great work, saving a lot of good forest. A lot of the public lands that have old growth today, if we'd been trying to take on every forest issue, maybe we wouldn't have had the victories that we had. But for the last 10 years, things really cranked up again on the private lands issue. You saw that video from 5 years ago, like Pat mentioned. If you were paying attention, you might have spotted me on the front. I don't think I actually look that different. You may have seen me. I was wearing a flannel, which I'm usually wearing. I feel a little funny wearing just a t-shirt. I'm always wearing flannel. It's genuine. I live in the woods. It's not a Portland thing. But today I thought, it's Sunday afternoon, I'll wear a t-shirt. Everyone can find out I actually have a tattoo on my arm and think I'm cool. But so we started working on this issue because for years before 2.5 years ago, from about 5 to 7 years ago, we started seeing an awful lot of action in rural Oregon, specifically around Triangle Lake, around Gold Beach, and up on the north coast around Rockaway Beach, where actually folks that don't live in Portland and Eugene, not your typical environmentalists, really started making a big deal out of this issue, and it created a lot of demand for change on this. And because of that, Oregon Wild was finally able to get the kind of funding that it takes to actually launch a sustained campaign. In order to fund something like this, you have to have a really concerted interest in it and a really good argument to convince people to actually pay for the work, because not all of the work that goes on these things is completely volunteer driven. And the organization that I work for, just to make things clear, because there's a lot of confusion over this, we're paid staff. We do this for a living, and it's wonderful that we get to do that. I got this job because this is where I live. This is my drinking water. I got this job because you saw me in that video working on aerial spray 5 years ago, because it affects me and my personal life and my family. This is where I live. This is literally my backyard. And you can see, if you look really carefully, I know it's a little bright, but right there you can see through the ferns and the salmonberry. It's mostly sword fern. There's some salmonberry in there, some devil's club, a lot of western red cedar. But you can see deep down in there in the bottom of the gully, there's actually a stream. And you're looking at almost the entire watershed above my drinking watershed right here. You can't see it all through the trees, but it's pretty much all captured within this viewscape. Most of what you're looking at here is owned by a name that we just heard a few moments ago from Francis, Roseburg Forest Products. Yet that's where my drinking water comes from. Roseburg Forest Products, if they chose to do so tomorrow, is well within their rights to not only clear cut every standing tree that you can see in this picture, including the ones whose roots dip into that stream, but then they'd be able to aerial spray it as well. If they did that aerial spray late in the season, when the water was running low, or we were in a drought year and this upper part of my creek was running dry or only running subterraneally, they would actually be able to aerial spray directly over what's now flowing as a stream. There's nothing that would prevent that from happening. This is taken just kind of down below my feet from where I'm standing, where I take this picture. I wanted to give folks an understanding of just what kind of water volume we're talking about. That right there is about 18 inches across. It's a very small flow of water, so it doesn't have salmon in it. It doesn't have steelhead in it. But it flows cold and clean right out of the mountain above my house, and then into a very, very small little catchment where it comes flowing straight into my house without any kind of processing or filtering directly into my home. Since there's been families, settled this property the last 3 generations before my family moved here, people have successfully been getting drinking water out of this stream. This is also part of the reason that I got that job. This is my house. This is what we do where I live. We cut down trees and we mill wood. I like to include this part of my personal story because so often those of us that are working on forest regulations or aerial spray issues are accused of being various things like, tree huggers, city slickers, Portland-based environmentalists, especially if you're associated with one of the statewide or national nonprofits. But this is actually how I spend most of my time, is in places like this. And a lot of the folks that I work with on this campaign do as well. A lot of us are actually loggers or foresters or forest land owners that are managing our properties. But before we get into some of the depressing stuff, I want to tell you I'm really excited to report that the forest that you're looking at here is what we call a working forest. And believe it or not, the other things that we've been looking at today on different pictures, and some of the ones we're going to look at today, are not the only way for you to get to build your house out of wood and have toilet paper in the bathroom. There's a lot of different things that we can do in order to generate paper and wood products, but even just good old-fashioned logging without clear cutting does the job pretty well. This is the kind of thing that we can leave behind. There are a lot of folks that I work with on this campaign that this is what we're leaving behind. I work with forest landowners all over the Coast Range who are advocating with us against aerial spray, who have mills like this on their property, who send Forest Stewardship Council certified wood to the local markets for people to purchase. And instead of those clear cuts that we've been talking about today and that aerial spray, we leave mature, diverse forests that are protecting our watersheds behind. And I think that's worth celebrating and worth folks knowing. This is what those forests look like up close. This is where we spend our time not only harvesting occasional logs, but where we spend our time hiking, where we spend our time getting our drinking water, where we pick our mushrooms, where we view wildlife, where I spend, according to my wife, way too much time taking pictures of trillium in this time of year. And this is a logged forest. It doesn't have to be clear cut. Because when we clear cut it and replant it under Oregon's laws, this is what it looks like instead. The second thing that I hear very often, probably the second most common thing other than, well, you're just some city-based person who doesn't know anything about forests, when I'm out working in communities where these issues are controversial, is, but Oregon has replanting laws. Has anybody ever heard that before? But we have to replant them. They love to say, we plant 4 trees for every one we cut down. Just the other day I was in a restaurant, and I don't have regular television, so I always notice the commercials. And there was this commercial saying, we have more trees in Oregon than we did before we started logging here. Well, yeah, I mean, you're taking this and you're turning it into this, right? There's definitely not more wood there. There's definitely not more carbon there. There's definitely not more life there. But I suppose if you count it just right, there's more trees there. So I guess we've got to give that to them. The thing that I love to point out about this is those dead branches. One of the other big things that I hear in my job very often, pretty much on a daily basis, even from well-educated folks on this issue that really would like to see stricter laws is, but we still need really heavy management because of this forest fire problem. Well, I'll tell you what, this is preventing climate change. This is causing it. Climate change is the #1 driver of forest fire intensity in our state. But not only that, but just on the on-the-ground impacts, look at those dead branches that start about 6 inches off the ground and touch each other on all those trees. We actually have great research that shows these forest plantations, these tree farms, they actually burn much more intensely than these native mature forests do that have thick bark, trees that are far apart, forest branches that are 100 feet off the ground, and a diverse canopy layer that keeps the ground temperature cooler than these plantations. And so I just like to walk folks through a little bit of those kinds of myths that we're challenged with to talk about why it is that we don't have to follow this model that we've been stuck in. So what do I do out there other than hear these ridiculous statements and field funny questions? I actually work with community groups that are based in rural Oregon. I do spend some time with some of you folks. I know a lot of you in the crowd today and these panelists here we work with regularly because we do events and activities here in Eugene, but most of the Forest and Watershed campaign actually takes place on the coast from Coos Bay up to Astoria. This is a picture taken 2 years ago up in Oswald West State Park with the citizens of Rockaway Beach for watershed protection, based right there in Tillamook County. Talk about logging territory. This is a citizens group that really, really made us launch the Forest and Watershed campaign when they started getting major statewide news over issues with logging in the Jetty Creek watershed, which 85% of that was logged, clear-cut logged and aerial sprayed in just 15 years, leading to their local municipality to spend millions of dollars on their drinking water systems. This picture is also from the same day. And this is the kind of folks that I really work with most of the time. And what we're doing is sharing our stories. And that's why I always tell it to start out my presentation, as long as time allows, I always start off talking a little bit about my story. Because the Forest and Watershed campaign is largely about bringing those stories of the folks who live around Oregon's industrial forest lands to folks who don't, and to elected officials who like to ignore us. So we work with these groups all the way from Coos Bay to Astoria. This is Rockaway Beach, like I was saying. This right here was taken in Portland last week, but this person wearing that Lorax costume, I'll tell you, is a friend of mine from Lincoln City who was integral in passing Lincoln County's she's from Waldport, not Lincoln City, who was integral to passing Lincoln County's recent community rights-based aerial spray ban. And one of the things that we've been working on doing is bringing those folks, not just going out and bringing the news out there, but actually bringing folks from the industrial forest lands into the city to talk to people. This is an event that we did training people on how to use the Ferns notification system in Newport just a few months ago, where we had an awesome room full of folks come and learn how they could actually monitor forestry and aerial spray so that they can stay on top of it, know what's going on, warn their neighbors, and document the damage when it's being done. A lot of what we do is based in these kind of two areas. We help people rally and get their voice heard, but we also try to bring skills into the community that don't exist there, and find the experts that are needed in order to really grow the power and the voice of these communities. This is us in Astoria just last week. We had about 65 people in the room in Astoria to listen to a presentation similar to this one. That was organized by local folks from Astoria and heavily featured folks who are working in Tillamook County, Clatsop County, and Lincoln County. We also do fun things like going out there. Most of the folks in this picture are from the Rockaway Citizens. This is us visiting Oregon's biggest tree, which is in Clatsop County there. And we just went out and did a fun hike. It seems really fun, but also that day we visited some really nasty stuff, so we could really contrast and compare. And again, here we are in Eugene with a room full of people listening to folks from Coos Bay, Oregon. From Coos Bay, Oregon. They're actually from Coquille, but the group is based in Coos Bay. My friends at Spray Free Coast and Coast Range Forest Watch, who came up to Eugene so that they could tell folks in Eugene what it's like to live down in Coos County and actually deal with the direct impacts of clear cutting and aerial spray, when what they want to do is bring folks out to their bed and breakfast and run their organic farm. So you can imagine what that's like for them when they're surrounded by this. The pink dots on the right-hand side is 1 year of aerial spray applications just around where they live and want to run an organic farm. These applications can drift up to 4 miles, probably a little bit more than that. Like we've discussed here, we don't have a ton of research on this. But so this is just around their place. Their farm is right up in here, and you can imagine the competition they're dealing with for clean air there when they want to have organic certified products. On the top left side there, you see the greater Coos Bay area with 3 years of spray data. One of the awesome things that we get out of the Spray Free Coast and Coast Range Forest Watch community, again, this is an organizing group based in Coos County, Oregon, that's fighting really hard against aerial spray. And one of the incredible skills they have in their group is these mapping skills to make these incredible maps like this. We combine their skills to make maps like this with my skills to make GIFs like this, and we're really able to start showing people the damage that's going on in Oregon's Coast Range. This is 15 years of satellite imagery of southwest Clatsop County, which is where I spend most of my time. You can see here Oswald West State Park. This is Cannon Beach up here. I want to point out to you right there, that just rolled over to the year 2000. This doesn't start in 1960 and show old style logging, as a lot of people might like you to believe. These satellite images and aerial photos, actually I have access to make these time lapses going back to about 1984. But when I first started making them and showing them, people would always say, well, that's just old footage. We don't do that anymore. This is just taken in the last 15 years, since the year 2000. Please look at the rate of destruction we're dealing with here. Every single one of those little brown patches that pops on there is a clear cut. You're not looking at other industrialization, you're not looking at agriculture, you're not looking at developing towns, you are looking exclusively at clear cuts popping up in forests that once were green. The rate of destruction is incredible. This is just one small area. This is a different area here. We're looking at South Tillamook County, just a little further south. This is kind of the line where the other one went up north. And I want to draw your attention right in here to the watershed of Jetty Creek. You can see the whole thing turns brown in between the year 2000 and the year 2016. Every single one of those clear cuts in their drinking watershed has been sprayed for 2 to 4 years. Right there, you can see the whole thing turns brown. We're at about 90% of their drinking watershed being clear cut in the last 20 years right now. There's literally nothing they can do about it, and most times during the winter, they can't actually drink their water anymore. So what do those things look like up close? This is what we're dealing with right here. This is West Lane County. If you've ever been driving out to the coast, 126, this is taken off of a valley that kind of cuts off just before you get to the passing lanes, where now we have the clear cuts just right along the passing lanes. This is what they look like up close, and this is what a lot of my backyard looks like. This is a photo actually taken by, I think Frances took this one, or a friend of hers when they were out in the woods, showing that actually about 2/3 of Oregon's stream network is unprotected from clear-cut logging. You might see these commercials on the television or on the internet from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute talking about how Oregon has strong laws that protect cool, clean water. I don't know what they're talking about. According to OSU research, this stream right here, steep flowing stream with a fairly small amount of water that doesn't really hold the larger species of fish, according to Oregon State University, makes up about 2/3 of Oregon's stream network. This is 74% on average of the stream network right here. So when I say 2/3, I'm actually being a little bit generous to play it safe. It varies watershed by watershed. Some of those watersheds, makes up about 85% of the stream network. Under state law, it's completely unprotected from clear-cut logging. They get 0 feet of buffer to protect them from the exposure to solar radiation, to erosion, and then ultimately to the aerial spray that makes it worse. This again is down in Tillamook County. You can see this stream here, when it's flowing in the summer, when I'm able to actually hike up to it, because I have to hike in 2 miles past a closed gate because it's private property, this stream is about 15 feet across in the summer when I visit it. Yet it has 0 feet of protection from clear-cut logging because there's a large drop just below here. There's a waterfall. It falls about 20 feet, meaning up in these upper stretches, there's not salmon, because there's not fish passage. That drop, I will tell you, is directly below a road culvert. I don't know if it would naturally be there had those roads not been built the way they were 30 or 40 years ago. This stream, as you can see, stumps right up to the edge of it. They go right across it, 0 feet of protection from clear-cut logging. When it is aerial sprayed, if the water is running, they will probably stop the helicopter right about there. But when the steepness is like this, you can imagine how much that helps. So getting a little more local real quick before we wrap up. This is West Lane County. This is the edge of Anita right here. This is the edge of Florence right here. This is West Lane County for the last 30 years. You can see rampant clear cutting going on. Siuslaw National Forest over here. You can see there's a big gap that stays green for the most part. But a lot of West Lane County, especially in specific areas, experience a lot of clear cutting in the last couple of decades. This is South Lane County, kind of south of Eugene and west of I-5. You can see here in Lane County, we have no shortage of clear-cut logging. Actually, we have just about as much clear cutting here as we do anywhere in the state. Almost all of the clear cuts you see popping up on these will be sprayed with herbicides. Most of those, not all of them, most of them will be sprayed from a helicopter. And then the real fun one here, we're going to get out into Kevin's neck of the woods, the next speaker, into East Lane County, where we're showing a much bigger area. And I wonder if folks can actually kind of see up here along the edges when we get closer. You can actually kind of make out on some of these time lapses exactly where the boundaries are of national forest and private lands. You see that hard line there? It matters for things to stay protected as public lands. Our public lands protections make an enormous difference in how our forests are managed. But you could see clear cutting rampant all over East, West, and South Lane County. A lot of North Lane County isn't necessarily in forest production, or it's just kind of shown as northeast or northwest in these. You can see we've gone back to 86. Every single one of these little brown dots, I could click it all day right here, every single one of those little brown dots is actually a clear cut that's being sprayed with herbicides. So this is an enormous problem on a local level. This is an enormous problem on a state level. This is what's happening to our stream networks, this is what's happening to our forest, and this is what's happening to our communities. So because of that, Oregon Wild, as part of the Forest and Watershed Campaign, has launched our Clear Cut Oregon campaign. And one of the things that folks always ask, of course, is, well, how can I get involved and help? How can I spread the word? We've tried to make it really easy, because this is a lot of fun to remember. clearcutoregon.com. Welcome to Oregon, home of the clear cut. If you haven't seen it already, I actually don't know if it's still up because it was for the month of March, but we actually had a MAX train in Portland driving around with this covering the entire side. Looked just like this. We've gotten a little bit of flack because this is actually a combined image of 2 images, and I'm always kind of like, you're not surprised that's not more than 2 images. It's no problem to find a landscape image that shows enormous amounts of clear cut. Our problem that we needed to put 2 images together was simply the shape of the bus. And so we put 2 clear cuts together. That's my kids standing in the middle in a giant old stump. All of the clear cuts here are real, and you can see the ocean there just off of the Cape of, just off of Arch Cape Beach there in the North Coast. So what I want folks to do today is make sure that you get signed up with us back here at these tables. Oregon Wild has a table. The Great Old Broads has a table. Did you get some information out for community rights? So there's some information out about community rights in Lane County and the Freedom from Aerial Herbicides Alliance. And one of the biggest things that you can do is stay in touch with us, get signed up on our email lists, so that especially if you don't have a ton of time to offer, so that we can really let you know when there's specific ways that you can help. We'll let you know when you can call your governor, when you can call your county commissioners, when you can call your state reps, or when you can show up and be angry on a sidewalk with us somewhere, all the various ways that we like to take action. A lot of the ways that Oregon Wild is going to ask to take action are going to be in ways that we try to have people from the valley really support the work of folks from the coast, because that's the way our campaign is designed. We also have stickers. We have postcards with this image that I'd love for you to send to folks who don't live in Oregon, or maybe send to your elected officials. If you have any trouble finding those elected officials, you can easily find your legislators at OregonWild.org or at clearcutoregon.com, and get on there and share these pictures with your community. If you're on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you are, share these photos, respond to our emails, and take action with us, and stay in touch is really the best way that you can help. So thank you very much.
getting a little cut off at the top there. That doesn't matter. I'm Kevin Matthews. I'm real busy these days doing something that I'm not going to talk about today because we're sponsored by a 501c3 nonprofit. But before, during, and after that other stuff that I'm doing, because I'm so mad that people are getting poisoned, I'm so stricken that our Oregon countryside is getting destroyed, along with the rest of our planet. Before, during, and after that, I'm a community advocate and environmental activist with a range of different groups on different topics, and sometimes just working directly with grassroots folks. One of the things that I did in 2012 and 2013 was a series of presentations to delve deeply into forest issues. In Western Oregon, really focusing on Lane County, which I was privileged to do with Rob Handy, then a county commissioner, and Roy Keene, Master Forester. How many of you made it to one of the Conversations on the Forest presentations? Thanks for coming. So this picture is an old-growth Douglas fir tree from Western Oregon. The old-growth trees of Western Oregon very likely were the tallest living things on Earth. This science is a little difficult because they were cut down before they were really being carefully measured and tracked. There's the people who are into, like, what's the tallest tree, go back and forth between the tallest of the coast redwoods, certain wicked tall eucalyptus in Australia, and the Douglas firs. If the records of the old loggers are true, these were the tallest things on Earth, and they looked like that. So I'm really honored to be on this panel with all these folks working on this really important stuff. And I'm going to try to just add 2 pieces of context before we can get to some questions, hopefully. And this is the first piece of context is about the history of our forests. Probably a lot of folks know this stuff, but I think it's important to honor what we had and to know what we had when we look at what we're fighting over today. And it kind of gives us a context for thinking about when we compromise, what we're compromising, and it gives a context to understand that we need a paradigm shift in how we're dealing with our forests and our environment. So this is McGowan Creek, which is a little preserved remnant of BLM land that has some beautiful big old trees, 400 or 500 years old, that are the trees that we call real old growth now, although they're juniors, compared to the old growth that was here in 1859. But, and I grew up kind of unconsciously as a kid, even though I was, went to Audubon camp and saturated environmental learning and biology and so on. I just had this kind of strange question in the back of my head. I love those giant trees, old fabulous things on the West Coast, but what is it about the West Coast that has why are there giant trees there and not everywhere, across North America, across the rest of the temperate continents? Well, eventually, I started to really delve into that question, and what I learned is that there were giant trees, maybe not as tall as our Douglas firs, but giant, amazing trees across North America. So this picture is taken in 1910. These are chestnuts, American chestnut trees, like in the Carolinas somewhere. Amazing giant trees, At first they were logged, and then the rest of them were killed by a blight. And in New England, the white pines that are the dominant conifer of New England, they grew to 8 feet in diameter on a regular basis. Giant trees. And the logging industry that started with selective logging in New England and clearing land, and then became an industry in New England with water technology, and then became a huge industry in what was called the Northwest of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, where Weyerhaeuser got started as a steam-powered industry. Then the railroads came across west, largely built with ties and trestles from that wood, and the industry cut its way across the continent. And what we're fighting for here is the remnant. So this is another example of the kinds of trees that were logged, commercially with real basic technology in Oregon. Probably most or all of those logs are just from one tree. It's a train of single log loads. And this is more what our trees look like now. Of course, they go a lot smaller than that. And, in the rotation times, if you think back, what to 20, 30, 40 years ago, they talked about rotation times, 70-year rotations. Then they talked about 60-year rotations. They talked about 50-year rotations. I understand Weyerhaeuser now talks about 34-year rotations and doing less. And I'll tell you, if you have something you call a rotation and you shorten it by 10 years every decade, it's not a rotation. It's just another lie from Big Timber. It's just another piece of PR mythology. It's a death spiral. And that train full of those logs is very likely going to a place like the export terminal in Coos Bay. So the other thing that I want to talk about, besides that historical context, is some of the economic context. And we've got some touching on that already, but when we get to aerial spray, the industry's argument is we have to do it for economic reasons. It's what's economical. Therefore, we can do chemical trespass and threaten people, kids, families, communities, wildlife, the entire ecosystem. To understand the economics and see perspective, let's pause for a second and look at the BLM checkerboard. This is a picture that I had a chance to take a few years ago from a small plane. And what you've got here is the forested squares are BLM land, which is second, third growth, working forest, generating wood, generating income, building houses. And what you have in between is the industrial forest squares. So this is an aerial view, of the pattern that you're seeing in some of the pictures before. And here's one of my pictures of a clear cut from the ground. And what's interesting about this, so this square corner, that's the corner of the industrial square in the BLM checkerboard. And out here in the distance, you can see the next square. So that's a mile. The BLM checkerboard is exactly a mile on each side of those squares. A square mile is 640 acres. It's a surveyor's section. And as Francis referred to, the squares that are now industrial forest ownership, those were originally dedicated to be homestead land. The ones in between that are still reasonable working forests that are the Bureau of Land Management land, those were given to the Oregon-California Railroad Company to subsidize them building a railroad, and they didn't build the railroad, they just logged. So eventually the federal government took back the railroad's squares. So the industrial squares were stolen from homestead allocation, and the treed BLM squares were brought back from this rapacious corporation. And that's the pattern that we have. And let's see what we've got here. Next slide. And so that pattern is part of the PR spin, the mythology and lies that come out of the timber industry, and it's also part of the exposure of people in this complicated marbleized landscape to the toxic practices of the timber industry. So in here you can see the checkerboard pattern where the dark brown squares in these map colors are the BLM land, and the light brown one, the tan ones, are the industrial forest land. This ochre light brown or yellowish color, that's the industrial ownership all across the county. The darker green at higher elevation where the trees grow less slowly, grow more slowly, is Forest Service land. So this is marbleized BLM and industrial. So the timber industry and the elected officials like Lane County commissioners who work for the timber industry tell us in a very general way over and over again that we need more logging to help our rural communities, right? That's what we hear over and over again. It's based on an economic argument. And what they say is the economic benefit kind of moves around, that makes it harder to argue with, and it's kind of a big blur, but you can sort of break it down to jobs, rural jobs, funding for local governments, which is a different thing from rural jobs, and, of course, the money they want for themselves. So, first I'm going to talk about the money for local governments, something you hear a lot about from county commissioners in particular. And this is very summarized, and how many of you have been to one of Chuck Willer's recent timber tax presentations? And how many of you have been to one of Ernie Neamey's timber tax presentations? So you've seen different slices, and this is a sort of a different summary slice. With Roy and Rob, we started talking about these timber tax issues and conversations of forest back in 2012, and it's really awesome and fundamentally important work to see people taking that and spreading the word and drilling down in more detail. But here's a summary of how Oregon's state taxes on timber work, just one way of looking at it. So we're using how a homeowner is taxed as a comparison, because that's what most people are most familiar with. So on the value of land, a homeowner pays tax based essentially on the real market value of the land. There's a tax rate, there's the value of the land, that's what you pay every year. A small timber owner pays a tax not based on the real market value, but on something much lower. The actual way it's calculated is too complicated to get into right now, but this number has actually probably gotten worse over time because the legislature hasn't changed the numbers, so it might be closer to 10% of the tax of the market value of the land. And that's a similar system for the land property tax for industrial timber owners. Now, if you have improvements on your personal house land, you're going to pay tax on those based on the real market value of the improvements. If you're a small timber owner, on an annual basis, you won't pay taxes on the trees, which in Oregon at one time were taxed as if they were improvements. You won't pay that, but it's deferred, it's not exempted, so you have to pay a tax later on when the trees are harvested. If you're an industrial timber owner with more than 5,000 acres, you don't pay an annual tax, it's not deferred, it's just wiped off the books. And now, when you sell your house as a homeowner, there's some exemptions, if you sell it and roll it over into a new house and so on. But essentially, you sell your house, you have to pay a hefty amount of taxes not on your profits from selling the house, but on the book value of the house, the amount that the house sold for. So, again, there's some more complications there, but you have a big capital gains tax. If you're a small timber owner with fewer than 5,000 acres, when you sell the trees, you have to pay a small severance tax, several percent, a few percent, to the state to make up for all those taxes that were deferred over time. If you have over 5,000 acres, when you cut the trees that you didn't pay any tax on while they were standing, you cut them down, you don't pay any tax on that either. So the industrial timber owners who are poisoning us and killing off our wild fish, and now in the case of Weyerhaeuser, charging huge, several $100s a year for rights for people to go onto their lands and hunt that they used to do naturally, and my rural people up in the East Lane County really care about. They're almost completely getting a free ride on the taxpayers. So think back to the checkerboard. Now, what do we hear about the problem, the economic problem of funding to Douglas County or funding to communities? What we hear is we're not cutting enough wood on the BLM squares of the checkerboard, and that's why counties don't have money. The same time that environmental protections rolled in and stopped the over-harvesting, slowed down the over-harvesting on BLM land, the taxes here got exempted for big timber. They had a boogeyman, the spotted owl and the federal payments, but they just gave themselves, our legislators, many of whom are funded directly by timber and sand and gravel, gave them a free ride. And it's really hard to pin down the exact numbers and make the nice charts like the going down, BLM timber payments going down, because those are simple numbers. These numbers are buried. In fact, I had a chance to ask the county administrator and the county chief budget officer a few days ago where these payments show up in the county budget, and if the county kept track of the amount of money they lose through these tax exemptions the way the state of Oregon does. The state of Oregon reports this every 2 years, and you can see how many hundreds of millions of dollars are pocketed by big timber. The county administrator and the chief budget officer looked at each other and had blank looks and said, we'll have to get back to you on that. So I'm still waiting, and I'm going to bird dog that because it's been really hard to get those numbers, and who knows, maybe I'll get them to cough them up. So a different angle on why we economically are told we have to do more logging is jobs. So this is a map from 1955 of mills up and down the watersheds of East Lane County, and you can see little mills, various sizes of mills all the way around, all distributed throughout the countryside. And most of those mills are gone now, more than 3/4 of them. And every time a mill closes, we're told it represents how terrible things are for the timber industry and how the sky is falling and we're not cutting enough timber and we have to push to go even more aggressive for the good of our rural communities. The fact is, and again, detailed numbers are hard to get because they don't really want us to be able to get a handle on this, but across the western United States, in 1980, there were 800 timber mills. 30 years later, there were 200 timber mills. It dropped by 3/4. Guess what? The average output per mill went up by a factor of 4. So what's really going on in the timber industry is exactly the same thing that's happened in every other heavy industry, every other manufacturing industry in our country, that there's mechanization, automation, and centralization, and it's wiped out most of the jobs, and it's moved those jobs from the rural countryside to massive, intense mills that are actually inside the urban growth boundary, in the core of the urban areas, like Roseburg's Mill and Seneca Jones Mill. So we're not getting jobs from the timber industry, we're not getting tax payments to local governments, but what about something more nebulous about, sort of community health overall? This is some results from a really powerful one of a series of studies done by an independent economic research group called Headwaters Economics, looking at the economic health of rural communities based on whether they were adjacent to federal land that was protected, no extraction, or whether they were next to federal land that had extraction, mining, logging, and so on. And what you see, these two green bars, if more than 30% of the land around a rural community was protected, their employment went up by 350%. If 20% of the land around them was protected, their employment went up by 300%. If less than 10% was protected, their employment stayed about even. And if there was no protected land around them, which is most of the cases, their employment dropped. Just one more lens to look at how, in the big economic picture, ravaging our forests doesn't help rural communities. Ravaging our forests hurts rural communities. So, fighting aerial spraying is an important and great thing to be fighting, because toxins to ourselves, our neighbors, our kids, our animals is unacceptable. Chemical trespass should be something we can make a clear legal line and outlaw. It's also just one piece of the picture of how we need a paradigm shift across the board in our timber industry in the rural lands of East Lane County. So let's fight this fight, and remember that it's a key branch in a much bigger battle. Thank you.
I'm realizing that we just have one mic for the question and answer period. And so if you'd like to come up and use this to ask your question, and then I'll hand it over to the person that you want the answer from, or the panel in general. So, questions?
Hi, thanks very much. It was terrific. Really appreciate it. I wasn't going to say this, but 18 months ago we moved into near Notai, and 10 acres of land, and about a week later they clear cut tens of acres right behind her, up against our property. So anyway, on Friday, 2 days ago, I was in Florence and at the candidate forum, and someone asked Jay Bozovich about aerial spraying. What would your alternative to aerial spraying be? And I was curious what he would say. I've been to some of the commissioners' meetings, and he said nothing. He literally said the word nothing. So somebody said, you didn't answer the question. He said, yes, I did. Nothing. There are no needed alternatives. Everything's fine. And he got a lot of applause throughout the forum. And I'm just so sickened. You know, I'm his constituent, and this was a Florence crowd. Maybe they're not, you know, dealing with it as much. I don't know. I don't even know what my question is. I was just shocked by that. He didn't even pretend. I mean, it was a huge pretense, but anyway. So, more like, what can we do when we're up against that brazen, just getting away with it too? What can we do except the great work that you guys are doing in your organizations? And I thank you, and I'll support you. Thank you.
Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, one alternative is not to clear cut, because that excess sun causes all that vegetation growth they don't like. And BLM leaves more trees per acre. They don't aerial spray. They do just fine. I mean, the other alternative is not to aerial spray and to have a longer rotation, because it'll take a little longer for those trees to grow up through that vegetation. So you can not aerial spray and still get reforestation okay. So not clear cutting, letting those trees grow up through the brush, and manual release is another option. They have folks do backpack spray, and they walk through the units with a backpack and spray. So that's their other option.
Yeah, I saw you at that forum. I was going to make sure I got a chance to chat with you today. I didn't realize you were so close. I'm in Walton. It was an entertaining moment in the forum when Jay literally said nothing. Half the room applauded, and half the room had a heart attack. I actually think it was more like a quarter of the room applauded and 3/4 of the room had a heart attack. He just had loud supporters. You know, you may notice driving around West Lane County. You know, I'm on the time of a 501c3 right now, so I have to be very careful with my words. But there's some things that I can say, and one of the things that I've noticed when I'm driving around West Lane County is there are two candidates for county commissioner. One of them, I always see her sign in front of houses, like my neighbors' houses. I see them all over the place in front of these houses, and then I see these Jay Bozovich signs on clear cuts, on logging companies, on parcels that are for sale. by developers, land owned by Lane County's infamous McDougal brothers. McDougal brothers, right? McDougal brothers, yeah. So I think that tells you a lot about what's behind such an ignorant statement, as nothing needs to be changed. But those alternatives, I think Francis is right to talk about manual release. I went to an herbicide management conference that the timber industry put on a few months ago. I was kind of literally chased out of the room to chants of things like "let's hang him." But before that happened, there was a presentation from some researchers that were comparing the effectiveness of herbicide applications to just leaving more wood on the ground when you log. And they were specifically studying Scotch broom, one of our biggest problems in Oregon. And they found that the manual release and minimization of herbicides was actually more effective than clearing the ground and scrape. You know, you've seen they scrape these things into these giant piles and burn them. Which is part of the reason we're losing so much of our soil when we in this type of forestry, you know, which is one of my biggest concerns that I think we don't talk about hardly at all. It's interesting. Francis put up the picture of them fertilizing forests. I mean, just think about that for a moment. They're fertilizing forests. This is another part of this issue. Is that we're losing the soil that grows these forests. Anybody who's ever seen a Douglas fir tipped over and seen that root disc has a full awareness of how shallow the roots of these tree systems are because of our high volumes of rain and the types of soil surfaces we have. So one of the things that researchers are recommending is stop scraping that stuff out into piles, leave all of those branches and bark out there to recreate the soil of the future, don't spray it with herbicides, and that is actually the best way to grow trees in clear cuts even in clear cuts. And then not only does the weed reduction component of that work, the finances work, and you end up with healthier trees because of the microclimates created by all of the fungi and moisture retention by all these things left behind. So when people say there's no alternatives, this is how we have to do it, here's my first answer. We do not aerial spray on half of the forests in Oregon. It's that simple. Half of the forests in Oregon are owned by the federal government where we do not aerial spray. Those trees are growing. They're also being harvested, but those trees are growing. We do not aerial spray there. That's my first answer. That's obviously not required. The second answer is there are alternatives. First of all, if you've got to use the chemicals, which I wish you wouldn't, don't spray them from the sky. That's just bad sense. We live, especially in the Coast Range, we're talking steep slopes, strong winds, moisture revolatilizing every day. You know, so maybe get down in there and treat it on a more acute level if you really have to treat it, and we can't ban the use overall. But thirdly, we have good research to show that that alternatives are there and alternatives work. So my simple answer to what do we do and with that attitude is stop tolerating it and make sure. I live at, like I said, I'm rural Oregon, so I don't get a lot of the city politics. I get a lot of the county politics. I've never seen so much interest in county politics as I am right now, and it's just because of stuff like this. So pay attention not just to who's running for president, pay attention to who's running for everything and vote on these issues that really matter and not just on party lines or on talking points or on the things that politicians want us to vote on, but vote on the things that we know actually matter and that we care about and look into these candidates because especially on the county level, county commissioners are way more powerful than most people realize. And right now there's a lot of bad people in power in our counties and there's a lot of good people trying to unseat them. So look into it and vote for the right person.
More questions?
Jason, thanks for showing those aerial slides from Google Earth of the clear cuts. And something that has to be mentioned is that when you show 15 years, then by the time you get to year 7 and 8 and 9, the first clear cut's already turning green. So if you actually showed all the clear cuts in their clear cut state, the whole freaking thing would be great. Would be a clear cut. So I wonder if there's some technology you can come up with that would just automatically lock on when it turns brown and stop inserting the green as it grows. But then the other thing I want to mention is the money system that we live under brings to bear so much money. That is created in our debt money system, and over the years it's accumulated. I was looking online. There's over $90 trillion of bank balances in the world. Money, gold, and bank balances. That's just bank balances. That's not investments. Well, $90 trillion is coming home to roost, and it's buying our resources. It's fracking North America. I mean, what can we do about that? What can we do about that? I'll ask Matthew. He seems like he's into tune.
You know, I think right now and locally, I think, you know, get educated about the concepts of community rights and the different ways that we can build democracy, and keep that in mind. And right now in our country, things are pretty dark and going sideways in Washington, D.C. So I think it's a really terrific time to organize and fight locally. And that's really the centerpiece of what this is all about here.
For Anne, what's happening with Judge Rasmussen's case? Is that being appealed? What's the future of that?
Thanks, Bernadette. Just for those of you who don't know, we just had what I've come to call Long 2, which is where Judge Rasmussen has just issued a ruling pertaining to whether the charter amendment that proposed to ban the aerial spraying of herbicides in Lane County met a pre-election requirement called a separate vote requirement. And Judge Rasmussen's decision was, surprise, surprise, no. And he pretty much bought Bill Gary's arguments hook, line, and sinker, who is, I think if we followed all of his clients, probably is notoriously standing with timber industry. And so it is our intention to appeal that. The appeal paperwork isn't actually due till April 21st. And so it will be filed by that time. And so we hope that, you know, Judge Rasmussen's decision is, I don't know, you know, I'm biased because I think it's garbage to begin with, but I would be interested to know anybody else who reads it and finds it makes a whole lot of sense. Anyway, we can't always rely on the Court of Appeals to straighten it out either, but we sure hope they will.
Good to see you all. Thank you for having this. I've been saying for years, my name's Diane. I've been saying for years that we should leave the forest, not clear cut at all, just leave them stand and re-employ the loggers and the mill workers as hunting, fishing guides, ecotourism guides. I mean, I understand there's a female wolf in Douglas County now. It ain't going to be long before she has a boyfriend. And then we'll have a wolf pack in Douglas County. There'll be people that will want to go see that wonderful ecosystem. And that's how you get jobs, well, leaving the trees there.
That and in the near future, carbon storage markets also. You know, when we look at the billions and billions of dollars that are being spent on trying to do industrial carbon capture and storage, you get one glimpse of how hungry the planet is going to be for any reasonable kind of carbon capture and storage. When there was a brief moment of progressive Lane County commissioners, there was some work done to try to make Lane County be a pioneer in a government participating in carbon storage markets, and of course that was shut down as soon as the votes went the other way.
Just one thing I would, you know, add there, you know, is, you know, like the picture of the plantation that I showed, the tree farms. You know, I think that we've got a lot of work to do in our forests after this last couple of generations of destruction in converting our incredible diverse mature forest of Oregon to these even age single species tree farms. And so I actually think that there's a lot of good that we can be doing with restoration logging that's thinning and pulling out those trees to re-diversify. So I wouldn't argue to leave everything standing. You know, I think that we can actually do a lot of good, you know, like the properties that I was showing, we're sending products to market. But the goal there is actually to re-diversify those landscapes, because right now so much of the landscape is 50-year or younger Douglas fir planted in rows. You know, with a lot of disturbance, eventually those things will rewild on their own. But if we can open some of those up and put in all new species, you know, these native species that belong there, I would argue that's a good thing. But also, you know, study after study is coming out showing that recreational opportunities like you're talking about, this isn't a pie in the sky idea for anybody who thinks it is. Right now, that kind of activity brings in much more money to the state, to local counties, and to local cities than industrial processes do already, right now, today, and for the last decade, that's been the case. And so I think oftentimes people saying things like this are told, we're treated like that's kind of a far-fetched idea, but it's not. It's the reality now, and it can be further the reality as we go farther. This includes some of Oregon's most rural places, in Southwest Oregon, BLM lands, just quiet recreation, things that count as quiet recreation like hiking and walking in the woods, not ATVs, not boats on the river. Quiet recreation on its own brings in more money on Southwestern BLM lands than logging does. Just today. We get new studies out about this regularly. Follow Headwaters Economics, who Kevin mentioned, that does this kind of research. And this is a real thing. Recreation and enjoying nature brings us more money than killing it does already.
So you're talking in a way about no logging out there at all. Stop all logging all. And it's a lot easier done on our federal public forests than it is on private land. On private land, timber companies will say, how can you steal our land and our money? It's a God-given right, that we get to do anything we want on our land. And Jason is right that they have converted it all. Of private landowners, there's no old growth. They have converted it all to these managed tree plantations. And these tree plantations, one thing we're lucky here in Oregon is that they replant mostly with a native species, Douglas fir. Douglas fir is our most common species, and it's also luckily, it's the most economic, the highest return species, and so they replant 100% with Douglas fir. And so it's easier for us to restore these lands to a native forest once they're in a plantation state than it is, say, in Australia, where they have a native species that is eliminated completely from their plantations. So the Forest Service and the BLM, a while back, this has changed with BLM, but a while back they were stopped from doing clear cutting, and so they went to thinning, and they developed some unique ways of thinning the forest to restore, what they call enhance old growth characteristics. And so they figure out ways to take out some of the trees in a diverse way so it's not on a grid. Take out every third tree on a grid. And so, and they leave all minor species that aren't Douglas firs in order to diversify the species out there, diversify the spacing out there, and to leave a number of trees they want to cut down to girdle them instead so that we can bring back some snags into the forest, because it's very devoid of snags, which is extremely hard on our cavity nesting species and wildlife species. And so, on private land, you can't say you can't do any logging anymore, but maybe we'll get to the point someday where we say you can't do any clear cutting anymore. And that money could still be made by thinning those forests in a way that can enhance the regrowth of a more natural forest.
Actually, I'm going to ask a question, if you don't mind, while Francis is on that. Is there any effort of any group? I'm thinking about when I first arrived here a number of years ago, they had the conversion to beans and grains from grass project going on. And that has been successful and been good for a lot of farmers. And you were talking about this diversity in a different way. Is there any organization that is taking that on to convert industrial forest owners to a greener way to do things?
Aren't there some showcase private land? You might know more than I about.
Yeah, so a great place. So the question being about private forest landowners that are doing good work to re-diversify. One of the groups that I work with is called the Build Local Alliance. And that's made up of forest landowners in Oregon and Southwest Washington. Generally speaking, they're certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, or FSC certification, which is, well, imperfect. It's a lot better, much, much better than what we've got going on most of Oregon's forest lands. But the Build Local Alliance, which has a website, buildlocalalliance.org. I think it's org. You'll find it. Build Local Alliance. They have listings where you can actually connect with, it's kind of like knowing your farmer. You can know your wood grower, and that's one of the great things that people can do. But they specifically tend to focus on diversity issues and carbon storage and climate issues. So it's not just about not clear cutting, it's about diversifying forests as restoration work or keeping them diverse as we selectively thin them. Absolutely, you should buy wood from them. I mean, right now, people are buying wood products constantly, all of us, and you're pretty limited in some things like paper products and other things on what's available to you in a convenient commercial fashion. But when you're taking on some kind of building project that involves actual lumber, don't go to Home Depot. Go to your local wood grower if you can. It's maybe a little more challenging, just like it might be a little more challenging to actually buy food directly from a farmer. But once you get that relationship going, I think it can be really helpful. And, like I was saying, FSC certification, imperfect, best certification scheme that we have on a commercial level, we have far less certified FSC land in Oregon than any of our neighboring states. Even Idaho has about 3 times as much as we do on our land base in Oregon. And that's a supply and demand issue. We need demand for it for people to be able to afford to do it. The folks that are doing it, they're having trouble selling their products because the competition is so great with convenience and commercialization. You're not usually getting your local hardware stores to feature these kinds of products. So plug those folks, build those folks up where you can. Buy as little paper and wood products as you can, but when you do buy it, knowing where it comes from, helping other folks, encouraging your local store when they're rebuilding. We worked with Mountain Rose Herbs when they were building the Mercantile downtown, or other local businesses all over the state when they're redoing commercial projects. Let them know that you support them spending more money to do less damage to the environment, even if that means you as a consumer might have to spend a little more money. It's a big deal to support that kind of work, and a lot of it is focused not just on these aerial spray and clear cutting issues, but on this forest diversity issue, which is such a key component of all of it.
Jason spoke about the FSC certification, and that is, of the 2 certifications in Oregon, that is the better of the 2. It has a lot lacking, but if you followed those regs closely, it would be a lot better than what we see now. The other certification is Sustainable Forestry Institute SFI certification, and that's a big scam. Most of the clear-cut pictures you saw out here today are SFI certified. And Roseburg Forest Products Warehouser is a big one. They do it's all green lumber, SFI certified, and it's just, all they do is follow the Oregon Forest Practices Act, which we know is the weakest laws for private land logging on the West Coast. Washington and California have much better laws than Oregon does. Yet if they follow the Oregon law called Oregon Forest Practices Act, they get SFI certified, so that's a big scam. They're greenwashing it. So make sure you pay attention to which certification it is that you're buying. You want to buy the FSC certification.
Buy recycled paper products. It's not that hard, especially bath tissue. Buy bath tissue made from recycled fiber, because a lot of bath tissue is actually made from old growth fiber. I think when we make sweeping statements about the timber industry, I think in general we're talking about the industrial phase of the timber industry, and it gets murky because there are smaller timber operators who, there's a viewpoint in the Register Guard several weeks ago where somebody wrote in and said, I'm a 600-acre, tree farmer, and we do this great thing and this great thing and this great thing, and so everything you're saying about timber industry is wrong because we don't do it that way. So, of the people who are doing good stuff on the ground, it's mostly smaller operators. The other thing is that part of the reason, this is a political reality, part of the reason that we have so little FSC certification in Oregon, especially this part of Oregon, and that the smaller operators struggle, is the industry punishes them. The industry punishes progressive timber operators every bit as harshly, and they have more direct control over them than they punish environmental people, activists, like Francis has been threatened and so on. So all the more reason to know your lumber grower if you can, buy FSC if you can, and always buy recycled paper.
My name's Gary Hale, and besides publishing the weekly notifications in the Eugene Weekly, I was a person who collected the data on the blood samples, on the urine samples that were collected in Triangle Lake during that pesticide study, and worked with Dana Barr and everybody else. And as far as the spraying goes, if you try to visualize this, picture a unit of land, maybe a section, a square mile, with walls around it, capturing the water, making sure it doesn't go out after it's sprayed, and capturing all the air and making sure that the poisons after they spray do not leave that piece of land. Then it's no longer a trespass issue. But the problem is it's kind of hard to do. It's kind of hard to capture that within that piece of property. And that's where the real problem arises with the spray. You really can't keep it in place. There was something else, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, so I just wondered what you could say about trespass and how that, is there, one of the things I wanted to ask at some of the meetings that we had out at Triangle Lake was, I'm a new person in this area, I wasn't, but I'm a newer person in this area, how do I protect my family from these sprays?
Well, really, trespass is the number one issue. When their landslide takes out my creek, my ecosystems, my trees, they claim it's an act of God. And it's only not an act of God if it would kill somebody, then they can do something about it. And the air, I mean, it's definitely a big trespass issue, but Oregon has something called the Right to Farm Act, which says that if they are doing whatever they're doing illegally, then no matter how they damage your neighbor, it's legal. They can trespass. It's legal in Oregon.
So on the issue of, usually when we talk about chemical trespass, people are talking about or alluding to aerial spray drifting while it's in the air. It's helicopter 200 feet up in the sky, it's blowing these fine droplets of toxins out of it. A gust of wind comes and blows it 4 miles. In addition to that, there's when it's dropped onto the surface of plants or soil or whatever, as especially in the Coast Range, as the water in our, the moisture content in our air condenses, revolatilizes, it can go back into the air and float around in a fog-like form. So let's say, to Gary's point, we can figure out how to not let these actual movement of that chemical in its volatile form move. Good for you, I don't care. You're still spraying 2/3 of the stream network that is running through your property, which flows down to my property, my neighbor's property, and our cities and towns. You're still poisoning the wildlife that are coming through those properties, like elk that graze, that have no respect for or interest in our property lines. And you're still poisoning that soil, that fungal network that supports our diverse ecosystems, et cetera. And all of these things move. Nature has no interest in our property lines. We all know this. Water always runs downhill, and animals move long distances. We all live downstream from these places, like we always talk about. I do not think there is a way to broadly apply chemicals to the land base without it being some form of chemical trespass into the rest of our lives and bodies, or into the lives and bodies of other components of nature. And so I do not think that there is a way to control chemical trespass. I do not think that there's a way to apply these toxins. I am not satisfied just stopping chemical trespass or just stopping aerial spray. These are steps along the way to a more ideal solution where it's not happening at all.
Pass a law that requires that all the chemicals stay on their land.
We need that law. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, in some ways your question, I guess, kind of begs for the response I'm going to give, is that, we can't, the people who are adversely affected by chemical trespass don't get relief. The chemical company, the timber companies are not held liable because our laws protect them. And they're written to say that we don't get to get relief for the chemical trespass that destroys our property, contaminates our water, pollutes our air, kills people. I mean, I guess it kills people when you get there. Maybe you get a little help, but it's like, you know, it's a decision that's been made as in an alliance of corporate interests and our government officials and legislators, and it's a decision that has nothing to do with helping you and everything to do with helping those who are looking to make a big buck.
You know, and there's one more thing. So there is actually a way, you know, when it comes to chemical trespass, having some form of herbicide application, leave the intended property and get onto somebody else's stuff, drift. Drift has to be reported in order to be investigated. I was at a presentation with the Oregon Department of Agriculture, who has the enforcement authority and the investigation authority on drift issues. And right now they're averaging 3 reports a year, despite how much I'm spending time in rural communities hearing about concerns of drift, despite how much attention we pay to the few people who do report it and get notified. Most people that I think are suspecting that they're experiencing this problem are not reporting it, and I think there's 2 reasons. They don't know how, and they don't think it matters. So I'm going to tell you this, it matters. You're probably not going to get the kind of relief that you deserve, but it still matters that you report these things if they happen, or that people who you know they happen to are encouraged to report. And here's how. There's a simple phone number. It's a 211 number. It's that statewide information line. They can actually, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, transfer you to the reporting line for reporting suspected drift or exposure to herbicides, which will trigger an investigation by PARC, the state authority that's supposed to be dealing with these things. Now, I'm not telling you that you're going to get some kind of reasonable solution out of this. In fact, I believe that you will be treated as if you are a perpetrator, not a victim. You may be treated as if you are insane and making things up. We saw this treatment go to people who've sat on the Board of Forestry last year who reported drift. I saw the investigator who went to a former Board of Forestry member's house to investigate a drift incident, do a presentation for the timber industry last year in which he alluded that that guy was just making things up and is just kind of nutty. And this is the investigator that's in charge. He's presenting to the timber industry. But here's the thing. If you report it, the data is there no matter what their solution is, and they can't say things like, well, drift isn't a real problem. We're only getting 3 reports a year on average. So these things do need to be reported. It matters if you report them. Reporting it's not going to help you, but it's going to help us in a systemic way, and you can do that, or your friends and neighbors can do that by calling 211.
Getting down, do we got a couple more questions and then we'll start to break?
My name's Bernadette, and I'm in the Pacific Green Party, so I'm a little irritated by a group called Lane Greens, who Mountain Rose Herbs has some problems with, and Seneca recently got on their board. And does anyone here want to talk about that group and the upcoming meeting? Is it better if we go to that, or is it better if we don't go to that?
So my colleague, so this is about Green Lane, the business network that has luncheons, and it's a business network. It's not sustainable business, or what they would say, what they told me when we were complaining about the Seneca issue was that it's not just for sustainable businesses, but businesses that want to learn to be more sustainable. We had a big issue come up several months back where one of what I would say is actually one of our region's most sneakily destructive timber companies, being Seneca Sawmills. I say that because they are really good at greenwashing their image and coming off as this local family-owned company, but they're doing just as much damage as anybody else. And so the perception there is a big problem that they're trying to purvey. They joined the board of Green Lane. Which is a really open process that just about anybody could do. They were virtually unopposed to get on the board, and so they were elected to the board. A number of us did show up that day and try to figure out how to stop it, and we were kind of bowled over by the process. It was just kind of nothing that anybody could really do, including alert members about what they were voting on. Green Lane's response was to our pressures from a number of organizations, including Oregon Wild, Cascadia Wildlands, Mountain Rose, Beyond Toxics, and a number of other organizations that are a part of Green Lane, protested and said that we were going to leave the organization, specifically to make it a little bit harder for them to greenwash the organization by being part of an organization as a timber company that we're part of as a conservation group. That's how they use that. They use that to greenwash themselves without changing their practices. So the response of Green Lane was to host the Sustainable Forestry Forum. The title of it is Clear Cut or Not, a discussion about sustainable forestry. It is a panel discussion that's being hosted by Green Lane. Seneca does have a person on that discussion who will try to make the argument that their clear cutting and aerial spray is sustainable. In addition to that, there will be an FSC certified logger from forest owner, manager, forester from Trout Mountain Forestry, who's one of the larger but more reasonable and does a better job than groups like Seneca with their logging operations. And then there is also a scientist from OSU. Honestly, I don't know much about this person, so I can't tell you much about them. But importantly, my colleague Chandra Legui from Oregon Wild will be on that panel, and I assure you that she is more than capable of checking Seneca's BS on that panel. So what I would encourage folks to do, the question was, should we go? Should we support that? Should we protest it? You know, kind of what do we do about this kind of thing? It's a great place for education if you do feel like resisting it and being outside with some kind of signage or materials to hand out. But it's also a great place to go in, support the message that you want to hear, which will probably be the one coming from my colleague Chandra, and don't support the message that you don't want to hear. Look for the opportunities to ask questions, to not let people get away with lies or manipulations of the story. And I would encourage participation on some level, because I think that this business network, Green Lane, I think they do need to hear from Eugenians that your decisions matter, and if you want our support as a community, you need to take these things very seriously. I'm very unhappy with the way that they've handled it by letting someone like Seneca onto the board. When we questioned the logical conclusion of that kind of behavior and what that could lead to, their answers, to be honest, were beyond disappointing, and they showed very little concern for keeping it actually focused on sustainability.
Do you want to say the date and time of that?
No.
Okay.
I think it's Wednesday.
Thursday.
Is it Wednesday or Thursday? I know because I'm gone.
11:30 to 1:30.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it might be fine to go to that and bear witness as a one-off, but I don't think it's a balanced panel. I don't think giving Seneca a place on a panel to further propagandize is a way to move forward. I think it's something to participate in as a one-off, but I think it's fundamentally a problem, and I think, with all honor to Oregon Wild, I think they're being co-opted to go ahead with that. I'm not sure what you do about it other than, mount giant protests to Green Lane, but it's not a balanced panel. It's not a place where there's going to be an opportunity to have a real conversation about sustainable forestry. There's going to be a bunch of lies, flat out criminal lies about sustainable forestry that audience is going to be perpetuated with, as well as truths. But that's not good enough. Is there a place to make an economic impact with who's involved? I think I don't really have the answers to that, but my gut feeling is the community needs to turn its back on Green Lane and shut them down. As long as Seneca Jones Timber Company is on the board of that organization, and that organization is claiming something about sustainability, that is bullshit.
Yeah, and I think the other place to be heard about that, one of the big things that we do, Oregon Wild does in the community, we do monthly workshops on basic activist and democracy skills. You can get signed up for that. If you want to hear about it, you can get signed up for that at our table. One of the things that I'm always trying to get people to do is write letters to the editor for the newspaper. That's a great way to kind of call out some of these issues without actually going to these things. And also, in your local hardware stores, if you want to make an economic impact on this, Seneca wants to be well known in the community. Great, let's let them be well known for who they are. And as far as I'm concerned, they're a company who doesn't deserve our support. They clearly put their stamp on all their wood products, so you know when you're buying it. If they want to be well known within our community as a local business that is logging, then they also need to realize that exposes them to being locally well known in our community as being clear cutters who aerial spray our drinking watersheds and destroy habitat. So keep an eye out for that stamp and make your economic impact as best you can.
I want to say another thing to clarify where I stand on this stuff. I think it's actually fundamentally important in the long run to have deep conversations that involve all sectors of the community, all ideologies, that involve the timber operators, local people involved in the timber industry. But those have to be real, those have to have long enough duration and enough detail to have real conversations and not just a festival of sound bites, which is what you can get in an hour or two with polarization like that. And they need to be in a context where there's real power leveling between the participants. And here you're having a panel with an board member of the organization represented by a super high-paid professional attack PR person. I don't see the power leveling there. All best luck to your colleague, which I truly hope. So it's not that I'm against having real conversations. I'm against having fake conversations.
Thank you. Well, I think we kind of need to wind things up. I hope you all feel that today was useful and you gained some knowledge. I know for me, I knew these people and I learned so much from them today. And we all are fighting the good fight. I know you're here because you're the faithful. So thank you very much for coming on behalf of Great Old Broads for Wilderness and Oregon Wild. And I think probably the panel would be glad to answer personal questions while we kind of break down the room here. So feel free to stay for a few minutes. Thank you.